Welcome to our very first session for our community-based research webinar series. Today's roundtable discussion, you'll get to hear from three different amazing panelists about how they engage with community-based research projects and the challenges they face, and also how they work with community partners to address them. There will also be a Q&A portion at the second half as well. So first, we'll start with a land acknowledgement. While we meet here on a virtual platform, we need to take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are located. We acknowledge the territories to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous people and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Inuit, First Nation, and Métis people. As I'm speaking from the city of Calgary, the following land acknowledgement will be for that area. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nations and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We also invite you to learn more about the territory on which you reside, and you can go to the website on your screen, native-land.ca, to learn more. As for me, my name is Jay. I use they, them, or zero pronouns. I am your moderator for today's discussion, and I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Calgary in the Soci Department. I'm also a member of the Canadian Soci Association Student Concerns Subcommittee. For today's webinar, Zoom-generated closed captioning is available as under the live transcript option. We also ask that you save your questions for the second half of the discussion. You are able to enter any questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A feature. Just please note that your name and the question will be visible to all other attendees, which means you can also upvote questions to the top of the list. So if someone has already posed one that you would really like to be asked, feel free to upvote it. All of these features you can find by scrolling your cursor towards the bottom of your screen to find the toolbar. Now on to our panelists. Our first speaker is Negin Sahib Javaher, using she, her pronouns. Negin's research explored the resettlement experiences of Iraqi Syrian refugee families in Calgary, Canada. Her research centers on the agency and resiliency of refugee women, as well as the role of women as service provider staff in the resettlement refugee families. Negin is interested in the experiences of war-fled refugees and newcomers with displacement trauma and is passionate about gender studies. After studying her master's, she gained professional experience in the field of newcomer resettlement at the Affiliation of Multicultural Societies and Service Agencies of British Columbia, where she has been working with various stakeholders to support settlement service providers, organizations across British Columbia, and these are organizations that offer services to newcomers. She also is a teacher, teaches sociology at Lingara College in Vancouver, British Columbia. Our second panelist is Alicia Clifford, using they, them pronouns. Alicia is a white settler PhD candidate at McMaster University who stands in solidarity with Indigenous women forced to maneuver Canada's prison system. Their research focuses on how the state targets Indigenous people via the criminal justice system to perpetuate settler colonial policies of assimilation. They work alongside the community using strengths and arts-based approaches to ensure Indigenous women's perspectives become a force for change. Over the years, they have worked on several international grants alongside Indigenous scholars that focus on Indigenous people's sovereignty and self-determination efforts in the area of health, sports, research, and education. As a settler, they're responsible for moving beyond reconciliation to directly engaging in reconciliation by creating safe spaces that seek a diversity of Indigenous knowledges. In essence, they want their privilege to serve Indigenous people targeted by the legal system because there is no justice system in Canada's settler colonial state, only a legal one. And our third speaker is Padrone Naziri, who uses they, them pronouns. Padrome is a Joseph Armin Bombardier doctoral student in the Department of Sociology at the University of Calgary, working under the supervision of Dr. Pallavi Banerjee. Padrome is also the 2020 Student Awardee of the SWS Student Action Initiative Award and the Canadian Sociological Association's Angus Reid Award for Social Activism. Their doctoral research employs critical phenomenology and intersectionality to examine how the increasing prevalence of polyqueer families articulate within ongoing racial, gender, and class formation projects. In addition to their doctoral work, Padrome holds the position of Research Project Coordinator for a community-based research project federally funded by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada. The project explores how the experiences and understandings of newcomer youth regarding race and racism transform during the resettlement process, and how such experiences and understanding may disorient programming provided by resettlement agencies towards anti-activism, or sorry, that was a slip, anti-racist frameworks and an intersectional ethics of care. Padrome completed their MA at the University of Toronto in the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, where they explore the experiences of queer Muslim refugees in the Canadian asylum apparatus. Much of Padrome's work is guided by critical social theories that emphasize the need to employ academic theory and inquiry to address everyday social injustices. Padrome has worked with various governmental and non-governmental agencies across Canada to address longstanding inequities in healthcare and social service systems. And Padrome has been recognized for this work by the Order of St. John, the Lieutenant Governor of Alberta, and the Governor General of Canada. Let's see. So those are our three amazing panelists. For the first half of this session, we have two questions that I'll be posing to our panel members, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So first, I'll start with Negin. Our first question is, many people wonder what it means to do community-based research. Can you talk about what that term means to you?
Yes, of course, and thank you for being here. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, where I have learned and lived as a settler. And I think this question is really interesting. Of course, when we're talking about community-based research, we're talking about community. But personally, for me, it's really around, first of all, community participation and finding ways to relate not only to the community, but also to their history, right? And I think the first question that would pop into my head when I would think of another project would be, how do I get in? How can I relate to the community? So I will leave it as that. I mean, there's lots to say and you have very interesting questions, but in terms of what the term means to me, that's what it is. That's how it resonates with me.
Thank you so much. What a great first answer. Alicia, I pose the same question to you. Can you talk about what this term means to you?
Yeah, again, like Negin, I think it's interesting, right? I really feel like community-based research means you have to be in and have relationships with the community that you want to be service to. So that's to individuals, like you can't just drop in, but I think we've kind of moved well beyond that at this point, especially from an ethical standpoint. I remember when I kind of began some of this work in 2017, there was just so much education within the institution that needed to happen at the ethics level. So there's definitely a lack of understanding and knowledge about that pivotal role that relationality played. It was seen as a conflict or a potential conflict. But this will vary across institutions. So this idea of conflict also comes up regularly for me. I'm sure it has for others as well. But I can remember sitting in a methodology class in my first year of graduate school, and I was challenged about the work that I was going to do. And I had to sit and justify my approach because they felt that what I was undertaking was going to be biased. I think community-based research, and we kind of had a bit of a dialogue beforehand, is inherently, activist in some way, shape, or form. So I really, for me, it's about ensuring that the people that we collaborate with, stand alongside, walk with, it's their perspective front and center. It's their words. I'm simply a vessel or a conduit for that, really. first and foremost, it has to serve the community and the population, which means that we should be thinking outside the box methodologically sometimes, but also that idea of what does community mean comes into play too, because depending on what you're doing, community can look really differently. So it's not necessarily just and for me, it wouldn't just be an Indigenous nation, First Nation, or a community. It's the community of women that I seek to stand with and serve.
Another great answer. Well, I will now open it up to Padrome. What does community-based research mean to you?
Thank you so much. And thank you to Negin and Alicia. I resonate a lot with what they're saying. What I see it as is sort of a threefold interrelated reflexive axiological commitment, right? It's a commitment to a particular set of values and ethics around who we are as scholars, educators, and community members, right? The various communities in which we sort of traverse. So it's, for me, community-based research is not only about describing everyday life, right? As a phenomenologist, like a critical phenomenologist, description is very important to me. As a scholar, description is very important to me. But then it's also about challenging, right, how power structures manifest in the everyday, how they manifest in our relationships between communities, right? Whether it's the university community and the communities in which we tread as researchers, right, as scholars, but also communities within the classroom as well. What does it mean to bring community-based research into our teaching, right? What does it mean to shift that commitment there? And so, one of the examples that I was thinking about when reflecting on this question was how I have been historically trained, right? Historically trained as a social and cultural anthropologist, historically trained as a sociologist, to define others, right? To define others, to develop a set of methods to conduct research on others, right? To deploy particular epistemologies and ontologies to make sense of other life worlds, right? And publish and present those findings on others. And so what, beautifully, I think Alicia and Negin for me are talking about here, those power dynamics of othering that occur within research. And so community-based participatory research, is shifting that framework for me, right? It's how do we enter into a faithful conversation with the people that we're working with, right? How do we shift power dynamics in our research practices? How do we think about what, the so-called other? And then, to essentially borrow a framing device from Sarah Ahmed, right? What I see it as is disorienting our taken for granted practices of scholarship, right? Our taken for granted practices of teaching, right? And then community as well, to interrogate that which so often falls into the background. So just like Alicia is saying, that there is so much to community-based research that we can unpack over the next hour and a bit here. But I think for me, it's really recognizing that disorienting nature, right? Where we're trying to flip the world upside down when it comes to our research practices.
Excellent. I always love when someone brings up Ahmed. So Alicia, I'll start with you for the second question. What has it meant for you to personally and professionally orient your work to community-based research?
That's a big one. Personally and professionally, I don't know if I can disentangle those two pieces, which has been very interesting. I mean, I really sit on a spectrum, right, where I make a conscious choice to show up and show up regularly for the community. I'm not only a researcher, right? I'm available outside of that role. So I'm a helper and a support person to the organization, but also for individuals sometimes. I volunteer as much as I can. So sometimes that means volunteering, not necessarily in my exact research field. I go into the prisons with the organization regularly. So, but it also means that I have to juggle the personal and the professional. So I have kids. Sometimes this means I'm not physically there all the time because I'm in the community, fostering and developing those relationships. So I will preface, I live in Treaty 7 in Alberta. I attend school in McMaster in Ontario, but my research is in Saskatchewan. So I kind of call it like there's a bit of a triangle there that happens. So I go back and forth between Saskatchewan and Alberta quite frequently. But my kids really understand that because I include them in the conversation at home, right? And that speaks to the way that I teach or anything else. I really try not to dismiss those dinner table conversations because I think they're so important to all of the work that we do, but also the work of getting the information out there. Dinner table conversations, for students to have with family, for, your family to have with their friends. But I will say that when I'm engaging in the work, it doesn't feel like work. I really actually enjoy it. But it's also pushed me to think outside the box when it comes to knowledge mobilization and methodologies. So I have a much broader portfolio than just research and academia. I've had to really hone and acquire skill sets that I didn't think that I would need or want, for that matter. So it's broadened my horizons on so many levels and in very interesting and different ways. And like I mentioned initially, there is a spectrum. And I use this term because I have a very specific orientation that stems from like my ontological and epistemological standpoint. So much of what I do may not actually have anything to do with research, but it definitely contributes to those relationships because again, for me, it's those relationships that allow anything to move forward. And even that's what I'm finding as I'm going through doing data analysis. It's all based on this idea of relationality, being in relation, not with just each other, but knowledge, ideas, there's so many networks that it branches through.
For sure. I feel like those relationship aspects are something that'll probably come up quite a bit. Negin, I'll open it to you. What has it meant for you to personally and professionally orient your work around this regard?
For me, the way that I answered this question was that personally, my strong sense, like how I was able to orient myself came from a very strong sense of connection and empathy with the culture of the community. I'm not from Syria, I'm not Yazidi, but I am from Iran, and that I had this is where, as Alicia and Pedram pointed out, this relates to some kind of inherent activism when you talk about community research, because this lack of attention to data and experiences coming from Middle East, and just looking at it as a lump sum of a section of this world that doesn't get enough attention, doesn't get its nuances. It's as if its nuances doesn't matter to Western academia. That was very, very inherent. And it really resonated with me that their experience, what they have gone through, their narratives might be lost. And that's what really attracted me to Dr. Banerjee's project, who was the lead investigator. So so for me, that sense of personal orientation really came from that. And professionally, because I wasn't the lead investigator, I wasn't going through the ethics and regulations and all that alone, right? Because Dr. Banerjee was the lead investigator, and I utilized her connections to the service providing organization, which is like a community-based organization that really came into place, how we were able to create the rest of this. So I imagine if if you don't have that sort of like empathy, cultural connection, strong sense of activism, like this orientation would have to be more professionally curated or consciously curated. But I also wanted to touch on something that Alicia also referred to, which is when you think about community-based research, you have to also think about post relationships, like, because it doesn't end, right? It doesn't end. And it's two parts. Whether you're leaving the interview room, that connection is not going to end there. And it's also coming out of the research. When you are doing community-based research, your connection to the community or your relationship with what was going on, it's, you should also reflect over that, because it's not going to be, okay, I collected my data and that's it, or, that was that. You're very involved. And for me, it was very different because I left Calgary and moved to Vancouver. So I left the community, but I know that Dr. Banerjee and her team have also been staying in touch. So I think those post relationships are also part of how this whole orientation works. And for a lot of researchers, I know that it continues for much longer than the actual research.
Excellent. Some great answers so far. Jerome, would you like to round out our final question?
Yeah, absolutely. And so for me, when it comes to sort of, some of the personal and professional, when it comes to community-based research, stems into, I think, first of all, as folks, I think mentioned, comes around with regards to it being seen as somehow lesser, right, or less rigorous, right, or less theoretically engaged than quote unquote real scholarship, right? And so it's certainly more subjective in a lot of ways, but and one of the critiques I think popped up in the chat, and this is something I wanted to chat about, right, is it being seen as less subjective, right, less positivistic in that sort of colonial orientation. And so that is something that I've certainly had to deal with, right, as a challenge in my scholarship, right, and in my everyday life. More so, I would say, before I found myself in the care of my current supervisor, right? Previously, I wanted to engage in community-based research in a different department with a different supervisor. And, these arguments popped up. Well, you're not going to be taken seriously as a scholar. You're not going to be taken seriously as a professional within the academy. So why bother doing this work, right? It should be theoretically minded. It should be, objective. It's just too engaged, right? And so that is something I've had to sort of disorient or work through within the academy. And what I found really helpful in those moments is just recognizing that sometimes we find ourselves in our own echo chambers. And that was an echo chamber that I had to work my way out of, right? It wasn't the truth of what I have experienced since. There are communities, my current supervisor, communities, organizations, professional organizations that will really nurture this, right? And this differentiation that people are making between, community-based engagement as being somehow less theoretical than scholarship, right, is also blatantly untrue. I've seen amazing community-based work that is very much immersed within theory, but the key component of that is that it brings theory down to the everyday, right? It brings theory down to that community level, right? And really demonstrates, right? And centers community narratives. So that's something I've had to work through, and I'm happy to chat about what some of that has meant for me. With regards to professionalism as well, the professional sort of sphere is, again, it's almost becoming a polyglot in a certain way, is expanding one's communication skills in order to really speak to the different types of communities you're engaging, or the different types of stakeholders. And I think that has been something that has popped up recently for my work with my current supervisor, right, on our IRCC funded project, is that we've got the stakeholder being the federal government. We've got a stakeholder being our partners in this project, the service providing organizations. And then we've also got the stakeholders of newcomer youth. So how can, and then of course there's our research team as well. So how can we bring all of these different entities, right, into communication with one another that actually respects the community we are trying to center, which is the newcomer youth itself? Right. So, when it comes to the federal government, there's a lot of positivist orientations there, right? About, okay, we've got to quantify what's happening, right? We've got to be able to check boxes, find a way to, determine percentages of understanding when it comes to race, racism, and anti-racism, right? And they want more quantitative methods. Well, there's value in the qualitative too. And so speaking to IRCC, right, working with our federal contributors there, right, in order to develop an effective communication pattern. So that's something else that I've had to develop. But I think critically, if I'm going to be honest, is sort of like recognizing the importance in forming coalitions, right? And so what I mean by that is working, with your coalitional communities, right? Working with your communities directly, but then also recognizing the spaces that will actually nurture you, right, as developing scholars within the academy. right? Community-based research is often sidelined, but there are amazing communities that will actually embrace you and center that as well as part of their mainstream project. One of the ones that I can think of specifically is, in addition to CSA with their research clusters, right, is Sociologists, Women in Society, is amazing when it comes to creating that type of community, right, that can be embraced, where CBPR can be embraced. But I'll leave it there for anybody who has specific questions about any of the things that have popped up, whether it's the communication, whether it's finding your space within the academy or forming coalitions, right? I'm more than happy to speak to those in more effect.
Excellent. Thank you, Pedram, for that. As a researcher who does a lot with queer and trans things, I resonate with just so much that you've talked about. But that transitions really well into one of our first questions. So before I ask that, I will say we're now going into the open Q&A. So if anyone has questions about what some of our panelists have talked about, or just in general, feel free to pop them in the Q&A section, and we'll work our way through some of them. But the first question that Pedram kind of touched on is many of the critiques of bias levied against this kind of work are often responded to either on an ethical level, i.e. the bias doesn't matter given the obligation one has to the community, or on a methodological level, i.e. a general relativist or you're making me pronounce things. Gadamerian humanetic position. I can't speak. Claiming the impossibility of non-biased research. I know all three of you have probably defended yourselves against such critiques, and I'm wondering in what fashion you have done so, perhaps on both methodological and ethical levels simultaneously, or in some other fashion. And have you drawn on any particular theorists? Does anyone want to answer first? it's a lot. I'm going to call on Negin. Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure, I can try. Because for me, Alicia and Pedram will be able to situate, be able to better answer this, because as I mentioned, I didn't go through the ethics process myself alone, but it's kind of, it's kind of interesting, because then you would have to defend your position as someone who wants to give awareness and space to narrative of a community that we need to actually hear that. And you have to defend that in front of some folks that are actually not very involved, and like these are structures that keep those kind of nuances out. But I think it's interesting to think of different kinds of fields as well, because like I am in resettlement, right? I work with an organization that works with all service providing organizations, and there has been a lot of change, especially interesting change and attention since the Ukrainian crisis and since the Ukrainian arrivals have come into the country. And you see that there has been some shift into recognizing the value of community-based research, because there's no other way, this reliance on quantitative research, especially from IRCC, as Pedram mentioned, and so on, doesn't give you enough answers. So they have recognized that there's more value to get information from these community-based organizations, and I see that trend going on. So I think it's it shouldn't be this way. It shouldn't be that you hit a point where you actually don't have enough data to strategize for social problems and so on, that you recognize the value of community-based research. But yeah, I will leave it at that, because I think Alicia and Pedram have went through the process more, so they would be able to add more to that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Alicia, Pedram, either of you have something?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I definitely both, right? Methodologically and ethically. I have an ethic of care and duty to the people that, I stand alongside, and am essentially a co-conspirator, right? Like that's kind of there's a spectrum. But methodologically, I pull a lot on Indigenous scholars because of the work I engage with. So Indigenous research is inherently political. very political, using scholars like Joanne Archibald, Kathleen Absalon, Sean Wilson. There's several scholars that work and write in that field. And it's kind of the idea for me of Kathleen Absalon uses the metaphor of berry picking, right? You have a basket and you're filling your basket with the berries that you're going to pick and choose that will be best of service to the community. And theory weaving is another one. Joanne Archibald likens it to the weaving of cedar baskets, right, from her community, right? You're taking different threads and you're weaving them together to create a whole that can hold something. So then, I like to think of you've woven the basket and then you pick your berries for the basket. But yeah, I definitely both, it would be methodologically. At the same time, I kind of think if Padrone had brought something up where I brought to a question to my mind, like if we don't actually choose to engage in this way, then how can anything change? Who will have these conversations, right? Who's actually going to step forward and do this? I don't know. I think it's but it's a mix. You to do qualitative work, like Negin was talking about the quantitative and qualitative, you need the numbers. You need the quant, but you also need the qualitative, right? So for me, it's a very fine line though, especially when you are presenting some of those numbers. Some of those numbers present deficits, but you really want your work to be a strengths-based, but you need to, so it's a very fine line to tread, I think, when you're doing community-based, because to get that people's attention, to have that grab, you need to present the deficits, but it is a fine line because you need to move so much farther beyond that, right? To be like, here's what's happening, but let's move beyond this, right? And then methodologically, like I now incorporate arts-based approaches. I did not think that I would be doing art, right? And I think that's a whole other, now we're in the realm of visual media and different things, moving beyond infographics. These are actually pieces of art. My data collection involved 6 feet by 5 foot canvases that people worked on. So they're massive. But so I think there's definitely, it's that weaving piece that's really key.
An excellent answer. I definitely would be intrigued to hear at some point in time more about the art aspect. Padrone, do you have anything to add to this question?
Yeah, I think for me, it's knowing who your audience is, right? Like, so if this question has been, if this argument is being posed to me, okay, who's it being posed to me by, right? Because then that will really influence, my response. So if it's in the academy, absolutely, I'll draw on feminist standpoint theory to make my claim, right, to my points. But more than that, though, which has been really important in my own personal development, has been Southern theory. Right. My current supervisor has written significantly about, the political economy of, the world economy of knowledge production, right? And the ways in which knowledge gets reproduced within an echo chamber that centers the metropoles, right, of the global north, and what's being left on the sideline as a result. And I think in tandem with that then is also, Vanilla Silva, right, who really talks about the ways in which sociological methods, right, can reproduce forms of power dynamics, right, in our everyday life, right? So what is happening here at the level of our research, right? And what do we want to contend with in order to challenge colonial white supremacist, right, and so on frameworks, right, within our work? So if I'm speaking to the academy, these are the sorts of literatures that I would pull on, right? Or the work that has been sort of informing my particular orientation within the academy. If I'm talking to funders, I think it's a completely different conversation, right? There is certainly an education piece. And so, one thing that Dr. Banerjee, my supervisor, right, has been really influential on is pushing back. Right, I'm so used to, just because of the taken for granted orientation that I have to funding agencies, please, I need your money to do this work, right? I need to live, I want to support my research. It reproduces this particular orientation, or used to produce this particular orientation that I have if I will conform. Right, I don't conform anymore, but that was the expectation of, okay, you've got these guidelines, I'm going to try and meet those guidelines as much as possible. But again, just in the last little bit, my supervisor showing me, no, you can push back, right? It's okay to push back. It's okay to push the boundaries a little bit. And I think that's one of the amazing things about this current research project we have with IRCC is that, you know, with this pushing back, they've suddenly opened themselves to changing to a certain degree about what markers of success within this project look like, right? Again, they were very heavy on quantification, right? But we made the case of, well, quantification doesn't actually work here. It's important, right? There are aspects that we can use, but what you're really looking for is experiences, right? And how experiences can then inform programming across Canada for settlement provider, service providing organizations for newcomer youth, right? And so what has been influential there for me, just because the question of literature was asked, right, in the last little bit, has been mulling over Anna Singh's In the Realm of the Diamond Queen, right? And specifically crosstalk, how particular NGOs or organizations may have a particular conception of how things need to be done, right? They have checkboxes in order to, get their funding or say that they've completed a particular mission that's been set out. And that may not necessarily align with community, right? But then for us as intermediaries, right, between these organizations and community, how can we engage in fruitful communication that fulfills the requirement for the NGOs, but then also distorts it slightly for the benefit of the community, right? It brings it into conversation with the community. And so we can bring that funding down, right, in order to engage with this community-based work through the community and then show the organizations at the end of the day what it is we've been able to do, right, by pushing those boundaries a little bit, right, by engaging in a form of crosstalk. And so, working as translators in different areas of everyday life, I think is important, right? Recognizing that not everyone speaks the same language, right? Whether it's funders, community, academia, and then knowing who our audience is in order to tailor that specifically. So I think that's, for me, I hope that's addressed the question. Feel free to follow up at any point but again, being mindful of who it is we're speaking to, right? And who's trying to speak with us.
Excellent. You actually slightly answered one of the other questions that have come up, but I will pose this in case you have anything, or other two panelists. So we have someone asked, can you speak to how you defend the value of community-based research, specifically in grant or scholarship proposals? I don't know if anyone has anything in particular that they would like to answer with that.
I can chime in here. I think it also really depends on the type of grant or scholarship it is, right? Because again, this speaks to Padrone, the language, right? So you have to learn that language and what language is going to work best, and then you shape it. I don't know if I've necessarily justified it. I just straight up say, this is what the community is calling for, right? And I guess the justification for me is that the community is calling for this. And, my project really, I used a method that not a lot of people use, and it ended up being that we piloted, it ended up becoming like a pilot project for the organization, where we ran workshops for people based on this method. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know for justification. I think you just have to key into the language of the organization, but I think and it's going to depend on the grants and the scholarships, because some of those grants and scholarships inherently lend themselves to community and based work, right? I think that's the big thing, is to seek out some of those. If you have any questions though, feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I'll more than happy to talk about different types of grants and approaches that I've taken.
Yeah, and I could just say, comment, maybe not quite answer the question, because Alicia and Padrone already made really great points, but it's just to recognize that the way that we can support and defend community-based research is by doing more community-based research, and by having the data to draw on. And the reason why I think it's still, it's getting better, but it's still kind of like looked down on, unfortunately, it's because the majority of the available data is quantitative and very different. So those get to be drawn on and so on. So when we do community-based research and the conclusions, the outcomes that come out, that's how we can support it and defend it and rely on each other and build on it until the point where we shift this knowledge parameters that Pedro also talked really nicely about, that things community-based research can't offer a lot, right? We have to support it that way.
I can jump in here as well. I think, specifically when it comes to talking about defending your work in proposals and that sort of thing. Again, as Alicia and Negin have pointed out, right? Sorry, to build on what Negin and Alicia have pointed out, I think also demonstrating or highlighting, the radicalness of community work in itself, right? And the radical transformative power of community work, right? That's where most of the amazing work, for me at least, right, in the academy, in the social sciences, where the most amazing work has been done. If we look at the Combahee River Collective, right, intersectionality has become such a buzzword within the academy, right, and outside of the academy, and it often becomes associated with academic work, but it was outside, right? It was from community members. It was from women of color feminisms, Black women, Chicana feminism. That was community work. Right. And so, some of the most amazing influences within the academy have actually come from community. And so what I'll do then is I'll draw on that work to make that argument, right? That, if we really want to know what's happening outside of our ivory towers, right, and outside of our governmental organizations, well, we have to turn to the community. It has to center their voices, right? It must include them in meaningful ways. Right? It can't just be on them, because then we lose sight of these transformative potentialities, right? So making the case for that, I think, is also important, right, within our applications.
So I just wanted to add another quick comment again, in continuation of everything that has been said. I think, but then we got to a point, because the reality is that you need funding, right? You need grants. And if you cannot afford to push back, and having grants is very essential to your research, then you are restricted, and you just have to make peace with that. And it's not a very, like a bubbly truth for sure, but it will restrict you, because especially governments and provincial funding, they have priorities, right? There's a lot of really great proposals going out and they don't get funded. And if grant is central to your research, you should acknowledge that you will be restricted.
That is a great point. And Pedram, your comment made me think of a lot of the works by Patricia Hill Collins on Black feminist thought and outsider status, which could be very helpful for kind of that arguing for community-based research. We've got one question with quite a few upvotes here. So can we ever shed power as researchers when we engage in research, even if it is community engaged work we are committed to? If not, what is our path forward? I hate picking on one of you three. So I'm gonna pick on Pedram, because I feel like I haven't picked on you enough.
Yeah, no, this is I think for me, this is a really easy question and ties into what Negin just mentioned with regards to Patricia Hill Collins' work, right? The insider-outsider status that we maintain, right? So I used to work, not so much anymore, but I would love to get back to it, in various QT BIPOC communities on health-related inequities. And, I would move through those communities as a member, right, as someone who is part of the QT BIPOC communities in Canada, who has suffered health inequities, right, and had to work through those health inequities. But at the same time, right, recognizing that my position within the academy, right, my position as a writer, my position as a researcher, is also going to pull me outside of those committees, outside of those communities, right? And the same with the academy, right? I'm both inside and outside. And so I don't think we can ever shed the various power relations or baggages that we come with, right? But what we can do is meaningfully engage with them, Right. And what I mean by that is sort of another term that I've sort of I want to push beyond a little bit in some ways, but is staying with that trouble, right? From Donna Haraway, right? It's like recognizing the trouble within everyday life, right? The various power frameworks and engagements that we get. Are sort of immersed within, but then turning to them, as opposed to trying to distancing ourselves away, right, in order to claim objectivity, right, as if we could ever achieve such a thing, right, from the positivist orientation, is rather re-engage in it from more of a critical critical feminist standpoint of, okay, this is my baggage. These are my the ways in which I take for granted or perceive the everyday world. Let's bring those into focus and work with them, right? And I think that also helps us develop more meaningful connections with community as well, because if we do hold these up straight and center, right, well, we're able to then bridge our relationships with community a little bit more, right? We recognize the power dynamics that come into play, but then at the same time, for me, is also being welcome to, and this sort of like, what can we do, right? Part of the question is be open to critique, be open to challenge, not from other academics and scholars, because that's what we're always going to be oriented to, but community members, right? Be open to pushback from them, right? Be ready to address that pushback meaningfully, right? As an individual, right? And as part of the community, but then be open, right? And available for that.
Negin or Alicia, do you have anything you'd like to add to this one?
I think what Pedram was talking about is really essential, right? I think there's that insider outsider status. I mean, for me, a lot of it has been self-reflexivity, I mean, I'm working with women who've been in prison. I have not been in prison myself, but it's reflecting on the fact that understanding why I didn't end up there, because I've had some of the same life experiences that these people had, prior to them ending up incarcerated. But I think we can leverage some of these pieces and these differences. I think it's about leveraging, but it also, leveraging some of those tensions that we have. But I also think that for me, it really goes back to developing those relationships, right? So yes, there's the power dynamics, but it really does go back to the relationships and how deeply those relationships have been developed and what exactly that looks like, right? And like I said, showing up, like I literally drive to Saskatchewan every 2 weeks to show up, have my face there. And I think half of the people don't really know why I'm there. I just show up and do office stuff for them if they want, right? Like I'm just another volunteer. So, I think it's interesting when we talk about the power dynamics. I don't think that they can ever fully be eliminated, but I think we can leverage some of those pieces and be very strategic about how we do that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Pedram and Alicia, there isn't much that I can say that is new, because I think you both did a great job in covering what the gist of it, just maybe like putting it into other words for me too. It's like, you can't ever take that experience out. I didn't have any lived experiences that related to the Syrian and Yazidi woman that we were speaking to, but I think consistency, as Alicia pointed out, and as Pedram said, being open, being transparent about the study as well, right? Not treating it as an elite subject that, you're just like the participant, of course. And I think the other recognition does it's again based on your community, like population of a study, right? For westernization, when we talk about those white supremacist structure, they're internalized in various degrees, and by just, as Pedram said, by being associated with academia, university, you can't separate yourself from that, right? You can never separate yourself from that. But yeah, and methodologically, right, you want to, community-based research, if you don't take you should not take the formal approach. I mean, maybe should is a strong word because we want to refrain from saying things very strongly, but you can't, you would want to plan for methodologies that allow you to break that. If you cannot do a formal interview and reduce that power relationship.
Excellent. These are some great answers. I think we have about enough time for one more question. Before I ask that, though, I do just want to let all of our participants know that this is part of a series. Our next webinar is going to be on February 10th. So if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, highly recommend that you tune into that one. You can find the information on the CSA website. And also, if any of our attendees do community-based research as well and want to contribute their knowledge, please reach out to Padrone or myself if you're interested in taking part in any of our future webinars. But with that being said, there is a really interesting question here that's goes into that methodology, which is what type of trainings did you all receive on community-based research? Many universities now offer certificates or training in CBR, but is that enough? Should we be dedicating time in methods courses at the undergraduate or graduate level as one way to challenge colonial practices and conventional research methods? Nadine, I know you talked a little bit about some of this. Do you have anything you might want to contribute with that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I was lucky to have a supervisor that was very, like that had this approach and was very well knowledgeable and very open to innovative ways. Like for part of my research at the beginning, I did like these hand-making dolls even at the community service organization. So, so I was just lucky to, I would say, first of all, be matched with someone that can accommodate those kind of approaches for sure and is open to new innovative ways. I didn't receive any particular training in terms of courses other than what my supervisor provided me through our research. So I absolutely would support that. As Pedro and Alicia pointed out, this is one way that we can, shift what we think of knowledge and knowledge creation for sure. So I think, if there is more to be said in terms of community-based research training, I didn't go through any trainings because I was again lucky that I got that training by being given the space to actually do it and learn on the ground. So I think that was my answer.
Excellent. Alicia or Padrone, do you have any suggestions?
I think same as Negin, I didn't have any formal training, but there was a lot of mentorship that took place. I mean, my master's supervisor, Dr. Robert Henry, who's at University of Saskatchewan now, but also my current supervisor, Dr. Chelsea Gable. She's got a CRC in community engaged research. So I think a lot of it has been mentorship based, seeing and watching how people go about it, right? Of course, you will then, we will then, like that, again, that berry picking, basket weaving idea, you take the pieces I think work for you, because everyone's going to have a different approach and it has to mesh with your own values. I think it has to resonate with you deeply. For me, again, it really does boil down to that relationship aspect. And even, Negin talked about post-research relationships, some of those pieces are so key. And I don't even know if that piece is included in any methodological training, right? I think, you need to think outside the box in some of these contexts in how you approach. But I do know there are some great courses and certifications you can do now. When I did my, methodological training for my, I would say both degrees for the master's and the PhD, there wasn't a ton of information on the community-based approaches yet. So yeah, I mean, I think, maybe it's that we put our heads together and develop some courses and curriculum, because I think it would be great to have that at the graduate level, and it would also spread beyond, or I would like to see it spread beyond just our individual silos and departments to be interdepartmental, because then you're developing those networks and you can look at different approaches that other people may or may not be using too, right? You can enrich each other's research. So I think that's a great kind of like thought to move forward with.
Yeah, this is a great question as well, and an easy question in the sense. And when I say easy, it's just like yes, no, right? But then also expanding. And I think echoing what Alicia and Negin have said, right? No, right? I didn't really receive until very recently formal training in community-based research methods, right? But I think that's indicative of the academy in itself, right? Or at least the parts of the academy in which I traverse, right? It's very siloed in the terms of what research methods should look like, right? And going back to my experiences with my previous department and previous supervisor, right? This particular orientation to community-based research as unimportant, right? Less theoretical, or something that's not going to win awards and scholarships. And if that's the particular mentality or particular orientation folks have to see CBPR, right, then of course I think it's not going to live within the department. But I love the question as well, because this challenge to methods does require us to incorporate it in education, I think. Right. The first course that I took on CBPR was actually in the fall of 2020. What are we now? 2023, 2022, just last semester. And prior to that, it was all mentorship, right, at the hands of, these amazing critical race feminists, right, that I've managed to find a community in over the last, I would say, 2.5 years. Predominantly my supervisor, who my supervisors introduced me to, right, but I think it's, again, indicative if critical race feminists, right, within the academy are doing CBPR, right? Like, I think it's indicative, once again, of that particular orientation within the departments of particular orientation to methodological practices and social scientific research within the departments, right? If the small racialized subset of people within the academy are the ones who are doing this, right? No, never received any training formally until last semester, but should we be doing it? Absolutely, right? And I think that's part of the particular approach that I take to my work, right, to scholarship within the academy and outside, is wide-eyed wonderment, right? Like, approach things with wide eyes, open hearts, right? And love, not love in the romantic sense, but that critical race feminist love that bell hooks orients us to, right? And I think that's something we should be teaching in our methods classes as well, right? That intersectional ethics of care that Alicia was speaking to and then Negin was speaking to earlier, right? Definitely should be included in our methodological courses.
Excellent. Really quickly, Negin, you said you had a point you wanted to raise about data ownership, so I will turn it over to you real quick.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk a lot about it, but just wanted to say it because I think it's beneficial just to have it in mind when you think about community-based research. And I'm wondering what Pedro and Alicia would like to add to this. So yeah, basically data ownership when you do community-based research. And if you, because your center is around, the acknowledgement of the community being in center and all the things that we have talked about, it's that, in thinking about data ownership, but also going through these organizations, like how I did it, going to a community-based service organization that also needed an outcome from the research project that we did, but also working with funders. I think it's just good to keep in mind when you think of community-based research and the acknowledgement for data ownership and the outcomes, and how can you return it back to the community, which is again something that my supervisor talked a lot about. That's how I learned about it. So I think it's just important to think about that you might come across, if you're getting funding from government, for example, that has an influence over that. So I don't know if Alicia or Pedro want to add anything to that.
Sorry, I was on mute. I'm happy to chat a little bit about that. And again, for me, we've certainly come up in the last, I would say, actually, all of our negotiations, right, with our funders, federal funding. has been around what information, are we going to be able to provide them? What information are we not going to be providing them? But then also with our institutional review boards, right? So our ethics boards, right? What information belongs to the community, right? What information belongs to the researcher or the institution, because that's really all they care about. What's going to happen. So that is a constant engagement, right? I find with community-based research. And I think that's part of the important work that we do, right? Is recognizing that, this work does in fact originate from and belong to community. And so the way in which we approach it, right, is, okay, what is the funding agency looking for? Because ultimately we cannot do this work without the funding agency, right? Okay, great. What sort of work is community willing to share, right? What sort of work are they not willing to share, right? And so having those open dialogues and then navigating that, right, with the review board has been an important component. When it comes to the data itself, what we've done is recognize that it starts not top down, funder, then review board, or review board, then funder, and then community, but community first, right? And so we do have our ethics applications that we have to submit before we even talk to community. We do have to apply for that funding beforehand as well, but then we can have open conversations with community about, okay, this is what they've asked for, right? What is it that we're able to fulfill in order to meet the funding requirements, but also what is it we cannot share, right? And so just having those, I don't know if Sarin, again, if that answered your question there, but that's what I was looking at, is having that open conversation with community, right? And then going out from there. But I think Alicia was going to talk a little bit more. I don't know if I interrupted you about that.
Yeah, the data ownership's interesting, especially in the context of the research that I undertake. I always go, like you said, Pedro, the community is first. In any application I put forward, in any dialogue, I really frame it as the individuals own their data. I'm just holding on to it, and I will only do, what they expressly give me consent for, right? So, and that's been put in my ethics applications. Right now we're getting approached because people are looking at potential art exhibits, those kinds of things. So it's one, it's like, well, I have to go back to the community, right? And talk to every single one of those people because they own them individually, right? So I think that really, I'm just the steward of this data, but they are the owners of it. And where this goes and what happens with it is really their decision. And so it's a bigger question too that ties into knowledge mobilization, moving beyond just the conferences. We're going to be developing a guidebook for women transferring to the Healing Lodge prison in Southern Saskatchewan based on what the women want, right? So yeah, I think this idea of ownership, even the word, I don't like that. It's a very colonial word. When we can unpack so much of this language, but definitely I do start with the women I work with. They are the owners because it's their stories. These are people's lives.
And then, sorry, just to build off of Alicia, something that came to mind and that we've sort of experienced over the last couple months, the last semester, the last 6 months, has been recognizing the fluidity, right, of what stories we can share and what stories we can't share, right? The ethical constraints around our research, right? What someone consents to at one point in time, or abstractly, is not necessarily what they'll be consenting to in the moment or after the fact. So ensuring that we have a room within our ethics applications for that fluid, ongoing, reflexive consent, right? And then recognizing as well is that these applications can change. That's something that sort of like blew my mind over the last year, because I thought, the one and done with the ethics application, it goes in, right? But since then I have submitted probably around 10 revisions, right, to my ethics application based around that fluidity, right? And so engaging with community, things will change. And so I do revise that ethics application, right? Especially for this project, right? Our principal investigator and myself are constantly revising our ethics applications in order to be aligned with what community feels in this moment. So knowing you can change that. And then funding agencies as well. I think there's like this unwritten rule that at times that if you get your funding, right, or this hidden curriculum, that you get your funding and we feel like we're trapped to the particular methods or what have you, right, that are outlined in that funding. Sometimes it's very strict. And I thought that way about IRCC, right? It's a federal government agency. Here are the rules delineated by them. Here's the expectations. But over time, that's not what the project turned into, right? Or what the expectations of community were. And so going back and having that open conversation with the funding agency and pushing back and saying, no, right, that quantification is not going to work, right? Or that particular data requirement is not going to work, right? That's not for you, that's for community, right? Has actually been approached or received in very good ways over the last little bit. So I think, just being open to those conversations and pushing back, right? Sternly at times, but certainly, recognizing that fluidity.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much to our three panelists. I have noted down any of the questions we didn't get time to answer, and I'll be reaching out to our panelists to try to answer those at a later date. We'll also be posting some of the resources we've talked about today, so keep an eye on our website and our Twitter, which is at CSA_students, as you can see there, as we'll be posting more of that information. And like I said, our next webinar in the series is February 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I posted the links to our website for the webinars for anyone who's interested and would like to register. Otherwise, thank you again to our amazing panelists. It's been a truly wonderful time, and thank you all for coming and attending.